Mr. Kofi set on his journey, and Amina was behind him secretly, her heart racing with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Kofi didn't realize that he was being followed. After a short while, Kofi arrived home, a small, dimly lit building at the edge of the village. He used his key to open the creaky wooden door and walked inside his house. Mrs. Amina lived in the village of Z. There is a popular market called Z, bustling with traders and colorful stalls. In that market, there lived a man called Mr. Kofi, who was a meat seller. At Un Market, Z was a peaceful community until Mr. Kofi arrived. Kofi was a man in his early 30s, known for his reserved demeanor. He had no wife or children, so he lived alone in his modest home. He sold the largest pieces of meat for the cheapest prices, displaying them neatly on his wooden table covered with a stained, faded cloth. Everyone in the village majorly buys from Mr. Kofi. He arrives at the market with bags of meat, carried on a rickety cart, and he sells all of them before the day ends. This made other meat sellers in the market very envious of him, and at the same time, they were surprised. They wondered where he could get such quality meat and sell it at that cheap price. The strangest fact about Mr. Kofi is what he does with his money. Kofi makes tons of bags of money from his meat sales, but he never eats good food or even wears clean or new clothes. With all the money he makes, he still wears rags. Yes, rags. For someone that makes that kind of money as Mr. Kofi, this caught the attention of one other meat seller in the market called Mrs. Amina. Mrs. Amina knew that he makes a lot of money and was surprised at the way he takes care of himself. So she was determined to find out what Mr. Kofi does with his money. At the close of the market one fateful day, Kofi packed up his cart with his leftover items and set to head home. Meanwhile, Mrs. Amina had been waiting all the time so she could follow Mr. Kofi. Mr. Kofi set on his journey, and Amina was behind him secretly. Kofi didn't realize that he was being followed. After a short while, Kofi arrived home, where faint candlelight flickered through the cracks in his windows. He used his key to open the door and walked inside his house. Mrs. Amina then began to peep inside Kofi's home through the outside window, her breath fogging up the cold glass. Mrs. Amina looked inside the house, and the house appeared to be smelling, with piles of old newspapers and strange objects scattered around. Then Mr. Kofi walked up to a very big black pot in the corner of the dimly lit kitchen. He opened it, and steam escaped, filling the room with an odd smell. Ah, I think I need to supply more meats because I'm running out of supply, Mr. Kofi said, and then he closed the pot with a loud clang, his expression unreadable. Mrs. Amina was curious to know what is inside that black pluck pot. It could be that the pot is what is supplying him with so many meats, she said to herself, clutching the edge of the window. She waited for Mr. Kofi to step out of the room. Immediately he stepped out of the room. Mrs. Amina walked into the house, her footsteps light against the creaking floorboards, and opened the pot. Hi guys, this is on Pleading with You. So please support my channel by clicking on the subscribe button. Turn on the notifications. I have realized that most of my audience watches my videos and never subscribes. Please be a part of my success and growth. Be a part of my growth, and please support my channel by clicking on the subscribe button. Thank you. Let's go back to the story. Immediately she opened the pot. She heard Mr. Kofi shouting, "Who is there?" And she quickly ran back, her heart pounding like a drum. She ran as fast as she could back to her own house, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't believe what she had just seen. The next day, she decided to keep a close eye on Mr. Kofi, hoping to uncover more about his strange behavior. The next day at the market, Mrs. Amina tried to act normal, but she couldn't shake off the uneasy feeling. She kept glancing over at Mr. Kofi, who was busy selling his meats and chatting cheerfully with customers. He seemed to be in a good mood, smiling and chatting with customers as usual. As the day went on, Mrs. Amina couldn't help but feel more curious about what she had seen in Mr. Kofi's house. She knew she had to find out more, even if it meant putting herself in danger. That evening, Mr. Kofi packed up his store and headed home. Mrs. Amina followed him again. This time she was more careful, making sure to stay hidden in the shadows, her heart thudding with both fear and determination. When Mr. Kofi reached his house, Mrs. Amina watched from a distance as he went inside. She crept closer to the window and peered in. Kofi was in the kitchen, chopping up what looked like pieces of meat, humming a strange tune under his breath. She felt a chill run down her spine as she realized that this meat looked very strange, just like what she had seen yesterday. Suddenly, Kofi turned and looked directly at the window. Mrs. Amina ducked down quickly, her heart racing. Had he seen her? She thought to herself. She held her breath, praying that he had not seen her. After a few minutes, she dared to peek again. Kofi was no longer in the kitchen. She heard footsteps approaching the window and panicked. Without thinking, she ran away again, not stopping until she reached her house. Breathing heavily, she locked her door and sat down to think. She knew she had to tell someone about what she had seen, but who would believe her? Mr. Kofi was well liked by everyone. Who would she tell? Who would believe her story? And then she decided to confide in her best friend, Mrs. Binta. The next day, she went to Mrs. Binta and told her, "My friend, I am in a big problem. I am in a big problem. I am confused. You remember the meat seller, Mr. Kofi, at the market? I followed him to his house yesterday. You won't believe what my eyes saw." "But who will I tell?" And Mrs. Binta asked, "My friend, tell me, what did you see in Mr. Kofi's house?" Mrs. Amina narrated everything she saw. Mrs. Binta was shocked, but agreed that they needed to find out more before going to the authorities. Together, they came up with a plan. They would take turns following Mr. Kofi and gathering evidence of his suspicious activities. Mrs. Amina would follow him one day and Mrs. Binta the next. For the next few days, they followed Kofi closely. They noticed that he always went to a particular place at night, but they couldn't summon the courage to follow him that night. Why would a man who is selling meat at the market always visit a particular place at night? They thought to themselves. One night it was Mrs. Binta's turn to follow Kofi. She watched as he left the market and headed home. She stayed hidden, keeping a safe distance. When Kofi entered his house, Mrs. Binta quietly crept up to the window. She saw Kofi in the kitchen, as usual, chopping up meat, but this time he seemed to be talking to himself. She strained to hear what he was saying. "I must find another one soon," Kofi muttered. "The supply is running low again." Mrs. Binta gasped. She quickly pulled out her phone and took a few pictures of Kofi with the meat. Then she hurried back to Mrs. Amina to share what she had found. Mrs. Amina and Mrs. Binta knew they needed more concrete evidence before they could go to the authorities. They decided to set a trap for Kofi. The next day, Mrs. Binta approached Kofi at the market. "Mr. Kofi," she said sweetly, "I've heard you have the best meat in town. I would like to place a special order for a large amount of meat for a big family party." Kofi smiled. "Of course, Mrs. Binta. How much do you need?" Mrs. Binta gave him an amount that she knew would require him to restock his supply. "Can you have it ready by tomorrow evening?" "Absolutely," Kofi replied. "I will make sure it's the best meat you've ever had." That evening, Mrs. Amina and Mrs. Binta followed Kofi again. As they suspected, he left his house late at night carrying a large sack. They followed him to the outskirts of the village, where he disappeared into the woods. They waited for what felt like hours. Finally, Kofi emerged from the woods, dragging the heavy sack behind him. He made his way back to his house, and the two women watched as he entered. They knew they had to act fast. They called the police and told them everything. The police were skeptical at first, but Mrs. Binta showed them the pictures she had taken, and they agreed to investigate. The next day, the police arrived at Kofi's house with a warrant. They knocked on the door, but there was no answer. They broke down the door and entered, finding the house empty. They searched the house thoroughly and found the big black pot. Inside, they discovered the chopped up remains of several bodies. The police were horrified and immediately called for backup. Meanwhile, Kofi was at the market selling his meat as usual. The police arrived and arrested him in front of everyone. The villagers were shocked and couldn't believe what they were seeing. Kofi was taken to the police station for questioning. At first, he denied everything, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. Eventually, he broke down and confessed to everything. He told the police that he had been killing people and selling their meat to the townspeople. He claimed that he was a very rich man in his own village and that the only way he could make money was by selling human meat. He claimed that this was why he always looked dirty and rough, just so nobody would suspect him. He said he sent all the money he made to his wife and children in his village. Kofi insisted he did it to make more money, but his words shocked everyone. The entire town was in disbelief as they listened to the details of his horrific acts. The families of the victims were devastated, and the townspeople felt betrayed. Kofi was sentenced to life in prison. The people were relieved that Kofi was behind bars, but the horror of his crimes haunted them for a long time. They vowed to be more vigilant in the future and to support each other in times of need. In the months following Kofi's arrest, the town slowly began to heal. Mrs. Amina and Mrs. Binta were hailed as heroes for their bravery in uncovering the truth. The village of Z learned a valuable lesson about trust and vigilance. They realized that evil can sometimes hide behind a friendly face, and they vowed to always look out for one another. As for Kofi, he remained in prison, haunted by the ghosts of his past and the weight of his crimes. He would never be able to undo the harm he had caused. Thank you for joining me on this gripping journey through another thrilling story. As always, remember to stay curious and vigilant, because the most unexpected tales often hide in plain sight. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more, don't forget to click on the subscribe button and turn on notifications. Your support helps me bring you even more amazing stories. See you in the next adventure. Bye for now.